I'm Allie Moeller, University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and my colleague,
Sheri Hurlbut,
also from the University of Nebraska, and we're going to kind of get you, since it's early morning, moving today. This is really an interactive kind of intercultural experience for you, all right? So we're going to put you in we're going to model the way we do our institute, and that is to put you in the role of the learner. Okay, so we have 4 tasks for you to do today, but of course, being the person I am, there's got to be theory and research undergirding what you do. You always have to know why you do what you do as a teacher, all right? Otherwise, you probably shouldn't be doing it. All right, so Byram talks about, he uses a great metaphor, the difference between a tourist and a sojourner. Okay? And he says basically a tourist is someone who is basically goes into another culture, kind of has some attitudes and knowledge, and takes that knowledge and attitude with them, but they are not significantly changed by what they do because they don't have access to language. Okay? So they experience it, but they usually go away kind of reinforced with what they already thought they knew. However, a sojourner is someone who views the opportunity to communicate, to experience, as one in which he can be educated and acquire the capacity to critique themselves. Can you think in your own background for a moment? When you went somewhere and the first time you saw something, I'm thinking about the first time I went to Spain at the University of Toledo, Castilla, and this man just came right up to me and just grabbed me and started kissing me on both cheeks. I wasn't sure what the heck to do. And so being someone who's lived in various cultures, I just went right with the moment. And notice by the time I left, about 6 days later, I was doing the same thing. Okay, so you get basically transformed because you can put yourself in the role of that person. Okay, and so you actually think about your own culture. Why are we doing that in Lincoln, Nebraska? Can you just imagine me going back to my department chair and saying, okay, Jim, here we are, we're back. Okay, he would freak out because he's an American. And space is a really important concept. So that's the sojourner metaphor that he uses. So essentially a tourist can transmit knowledge, but a sojourner can communicate and develop relationships because they have access to language, all right? So basically, being the queen of can-do statements and linguafolio, I've got to get my can-do statements in here, which is the way I start every class, all right? I can discuss, this is what you're going to be able to do at the end, I hope, because we're going to do a little check for understanding. I can discuss the importance of intercultural communicative competence in the foreign language classroom. That's one goal. I can list the common themes that emerged from models. We're going to go into 4 models of intercultural competency with you, and then describe what the basic characteristics are of each. I'm going to be able to evaluate and reflect upon activities that we did here and design and build them in my own classroom. And number 4, I can create activities in my foreign language classroom. Okay? Everybody's on the same page? All right, so the question then really becomes, why should there even be an intercultural focus in the language classroom? Well, that's probably, that's one of the areas where teachers are really concerned about teaching culture because they don't know it all, right? That's the #1 reason people don't teach it according to research. So basically, we're going to tell you a little bit about it. So ACTFL says what we need to do is we need to really realize that culture and language are inextricably linked. And what they talk about in the ACTFL standards is being able to know what to say, to whom, when, and why. Okay? That's kind of why we want to know culture. Oftentimes, culture is so important that even if we speak perfect grammar, but we make a cultural faux pas, it alienates them more. Okay, that's actually been documented as well. Inextricably linked language and culture. We'll show some examples. And of course, globalization. In my own neighborhood, a Vietnamese family and a Chinese family recently moved in. And so my Nebraska neighbors said, well, Allie, they're not really very friendly. And I said, well, in China, there's kind of this respect thing going on, and so maybe we could think about some other ways to really get over, maybe we could invite them to our home. And they said, oh. And so immediately had this, you have to kind of get people, especially in our America-centric kind of environment, which is, I love that particular icon there. We have a tendency to look through every lens that's ours. And that's kind of the purpose of the classroom, is to get that shift to happen among our students. But now, this seems like vaporware to me. How do you do that without offending someone else because you're trying to make them understand another culture when, you know, after all, we're exceptional, right? This is what we say about America.
Okay, so we talk about teaching culture versus teaching interculturality, and they're two very different things, right? But of course, teaching culture is the center point of teaching interculturality. But in interculturality, we're going to go deeper and further with that idea. So with teaching culture, we've learned about the 3 Ps, the practices, the products, and the perspectives of a culture, and of course we still teach those. But what we want to do in an intercultural classroom is we want to have our students combine their growing language skills with their growing cultural knowledge in order so they can behave appropriately in the target culture. And I like to think about the example of various cultural rites. Let's think about weddings or funerals, for example. You can learn about a Chinese wedding, and you can read about a Chinese wedding, and you can find out what the bride wears and what the groom wears and what happens and so on. But does that mean you would be able to attend a Chinese wedding and behave appropriately? That would be the difference between teaching culture and teaching interculturality. Would you know what to say to the bride, what to say to the groom, how to introduce your spouse to someone else at the wedding? Okay, so those kind of things. You have to go deeper into the culture so you understand how to behave appropriately. And then, so that's interculturality. Then we add on the language piece. And then we call this intercultural communicative competence. Because not only do we know how to behave properly in another culture, but we can do it in the target language. Okay, so that's intercultural communicative competence, where the language meets the culture. We're now doing it in the target language, and that's where we want to get our students. Okay, so intercultural communicative competence, I'm going to call it ICC for short because it's kind of hard to say that. So ICC means to develop an openness for, or a curiosity about, or an empathy towards another culture and peoples of another culture in order to work together cooperatively for a common purpose. It means to evaluate your own perceptions and your beliefs and your thoughts and your feelings first in order to develop a deeper self-knowledge and understanding of yourself so that then you're ready to understand someone else. And eventually, hopefully, you can become a mediator. You understand that other cultures so well that you can become a mediator between various cultures and explain and interpret differences and perspectives and so on among cultures, even though you may share very different worldviews, which may be the case for many of our STARTALK languages. The cultures are very different from our American students' cultures. Okay, Allie?
Okay, so basically what an interculturally competent foreign language speaker is able to do, they have the skills, meaning the language skills, all right? But they also have an attitude that is more one of open mindset rather than one coming in with one lens. And then also knowledge. There are facts that we need to know. And it's not just attitude, but you have to have a knowledge base. And so those are the 3 components of Byram's model. You'll hear a little bit more about this. But basically then what the intercultural communicative competence piece is, that we then turn these 3 elements into relationships. You all have been to foreign countries, all of us have, right? And the first time that you can actually build a relationship where you can talk about something of importance to you is a world of difference than when you're a tourist and just observing, okay? So do we have a good feel for the difference between culture and interculturality? It's kind of a very abstract kind of thing to want to teach, and so we're going to actually have you working in groups to kind of experience it as well. So what I did is I spent a year kind of reading everything with 2 or 3 of my graduate students that was ever written on intercultural communicative competency. It's coming out in the next volume of Flannels if you want to read it, okay? But I basically looked at all the models that existed, because I love models, but you know what? I'm one of those that says, so what? What do we do with it in the classroom? That's my real question, all right? Interesting stuff, what do I do with it in the classroom? So these are the three themes that were common to all of the models that we looked at. Number one, the development of self-awareness and really identity transformation. Moving from self to other and back again, this kind of going back and forth. And this is the pivotal one, student as inquirer, putting the student in the role of a cultural anthropologist who's looking and finding and discovering knowledge, instead of me standing there telling you. Whenever you do learning unto people, it's your knowledge. When it's done by them, it belongs to them. It's owned by them, okay? And the third one is basically that developing intercultural communicative, I hate this term, competence, okay? ICC, it sounds like a emergency room term. That's why I can't say that either. But developing ICC is a process, just like interlanguage, right? When you learn a language, you take one step forward, you think you got it down, and then some exception happens, and it's like a cha-cha. Cha-cha, cha-cha-cha. 2 steps backwards. And then you're thinking, I don't really get it. And then you move forward again, you go, I get it. And then it's, whoa, I think there's something else I don't understand, okay? So it's a process, okay? So here are basically the 4 models that I focused on. Bennett's model of developmental intercultural sensitivity, obviously, his main concern is moving from ethnocentrism, my view, okay, to an ethno-relativism, you know, kind of looking at expanding that view. And then Gudekunst, one of my absolute favorites, he looks at basically the self-awareness and what are the steps involved to move to other. Byram, we all know, he's looking at the 3 knowledge, right, attitudes, and obviously the skills that you need to really be able to interact in another culture. And here's my absolute favorite, Deardorff, who doesn't get a lot of script, and I'll tell you, she should. And we're going to talk a lot about her in the session today. But basically, this is a continuous process in which all of those things that the others have identified come together, and she gives you a model for how to integrate it. And we're going to use that model to integrate one of the activities that you will experience today. So here's one of the favorite activities. I did this with my 7th graders, I don't know, 30 years ago. And basically, you know, to kind of illustrate how culture is embedded in language, Proverbs is a great venue. So I remember first when I came to the United States, one of the first things I learned was this proverb, the early bird gets the worm. And I'm thinking, the early bird gets the worm. And one of my mom said, oh, that means Morgenstund hat Gold im Mund. The morning hour has gold in its mouth. And I said, well, Mom, I like that better. And she says, why? And I said, because it talks about nature and the morning hour, and you get up and you see the sunrise. And she goes, yeah, what does that tell us about the culture? And I went, Germans love nature. What about the Americans? Well, the early bird gets the worm. I think they're kind of competitive, aren't they? And she said, they are. It seems that way, doesn't it? And so I said, you know, I also noticed with the money thing, you know, they have their presidents on, and Germany has castles and Mozart. And she says, again, what does that tell you about the culture? So we're going to do this activity with you.
So this is the first activity, and this is why we wanted you in languages, or at least have one person at the table that maybe speaks that language, because we have kind of a proverb that's similar to the early bird gets the worm, but in the various languages. And we'd like you to spend 3 minutes or so, and the proverbs are on these little table tents if you can't see them up there. And see if you can understand, tell us, what does that tell about the culture?
We're looking at a proverb. The proverb in English is the early bird gets the worm. And then in all the different languages, how is that idea expressed? And the French is very general. It's the future belongs to those who get up early in the morning. But there's no imagery. It's not about birds or worms, or like some of the other examples have something like very, very specific that you can envisage.
Okay.
Right.
It works.
Great acting. Get one of these.
Bicycle bell. Saves your voice. Okay. So what we'd like to do now is go briefly around the different tables and find out what you thought the proverb told about the culture. So the first one is Spanish. Does someone speak Spanish and can say the proverb in Spanish?
El que madruga, Dios lo ayuda.
And?
Well, we had a really great conversation about the spiritual aspects of Spanish and Latino cultures, and also that the way that it's translated kind of shifts the meaning a little bit, because in Spanish, el que madruga puts the responsibility on the person who
Oh,
rises
interesting.
first, and then the reaction is that he will be helped by
God.
God. But in English, it's God. If God is first. So we had a very philosophical conversation.
So it shows how yes, very much so, how the language interacts with the culture. Great.
How about the Chinese table over here?
Yeah.
Mandarin.
Okay.
And the reason say cleanse birds because of Chinese virtues and to be humble. So always say, I'm not good enough, so I have to go.
And I'm not good enough, so I have to
So always
work
humble
harder.
is one of the virtues in the Chinese culture.
Are we seeing the connection between?
And then also like it's diligence, that means it's, I put out more efforts for that. I might be thinking, well, I'm not good enough, but it's okay. I get work harder and get more.
Yes.
I think that's really a key in the Chinese
It is.
culture, actually.
Exactly. I have 5 Chinese doctoral students. That is exactly the way they feel. That is always so interesting. Okay, one more over here. How about this table? What language?
This was Hindi.
Hindi?
This was Hindi, and
And it says, don't put it off for tomorrow. Time is passing by.
So what do you think that tells us about the culture?
Just you do it today and
Get it done.
get it done.
Okay, how about Russian?
Well, Russian is probably the closest to Spanish. It translates almost the same, and we had a nice conversation. Probably it's not connected with spirituality, but sort of the most enthusiastic person has been rewarded with blessings, but it's not about spirituality, it's about energy.
Okay.
So
How about this language? Do we have French or Gujarati? What do we got?
We discussed French.
We discussed French. All right.
I guess we noticed that the French, at least in this formulation, does not use a metaphor. In other words, there are no birds or worms or golds or mouth or whatever it is. It's simply the future belongs to those who rise up, get up early in the morning. We talked about it being like future-oriented, non-metaphorical, very general, somewhat abstract. But we also expressed a bit of reservation as to whether, from the proverb, can you really go from that to the whole culture?
Well, historically, let's think about France.
Yeah.
What do you think that proverb says? Rising up early.
Are you thinking of French imperialism, or what are you thinking of?
I'm thinking more of French Revolutionary period. One of the women that interpreted this, maybe she was wrong, but she basically said it is abstract in the sense that when there is something, you need to address it. When there is something going wrong, you need to rise against. You need to rise up and take care of it. I thought that was kind of interesting. But anyway, we could discuss that later. Last one?
We started with French and then we got stuck with German.
Wait a minute. Got stuck with
German. But anyway, we also found something in connection with the invoking God and that, because the Arabic proverb, al-barakatu fil bukur, which means the blessing is in the early time. So
like
you just
Spanish.
go, so having God in the picture is always.
So you have some religious elements here,
Yeah.
you might have some philosophical issues in the French, and you definitely have some hardworking ethic over here with the Chinese. You see, it tells us something. The point is that you have the students do this in your classroom with their own proverb. And take a look, what does that communicate, okay? All right.
Then maybe you can have students develop their own proverb.
Yep.
That would reflect the culture that they're learning. Okay. A lot of ways to go with that. Okay, the second theme that we found in the research was student as inquirer, as Ali pointed out before, the student as acting as a cultural anthropologist to explore and discover knowledge on their own, both in and outside the classroom. And in this kind of a classroom, an ICC classroom that stresses this type of knowledge, the teacher's goal is to create an environment of curiosity and inquiry. So the teacher does not have to be the expert in all things. The teacher gives the students permission to discover and explore. So the teacher's role is more as a guide or a mentor or a facilitator. And this is more of a constructivist sort of approach to knowledge, where students work together to co-create knowledge and form and share new values and opinions. So what we're going to do now is put you in the role of the learner, and so that you can become cultural anthropologists yourselves. And we decided to use the context of New Orleans, Louisiana. Of course, in your classrooms, you would use something that pertained to the culture that you're teaching. So we're going to choose New Orleans, Louisiana, and you'll notice in the middle of each table we have a large piece of paper, and there are a few markers there. And what we'd first like you to do is each person at the table will spend 2 or 3 minutes. I want you to think about New Orleans, and I want you to write on this big piece of paper one thing that you know about New Orleans. It doesn't have to be specifically about the city. It might be about the people that live there, about the culture, something that comes to mind when you think of New Orleans. So just jot down one thing, and we'll spend a few minutes, and then we'll come back together.
Anything you want to add to this list when you think of New Orleans?
I can hear the flood, but that's not really about New Orleans.
Yeah, just told her all
French
nothing about New
Oh, yeah, music. I went to a fabulous diner in New Orleans at a conference, but it was not a culturally relevant diner. It was just a diner.
Good place.
Wonderful.
Bayou?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, let's put on our learner hat for a minute. Why are we doing this activity?
See what we know.
Exactly. Background knowledge, collecting background knowledge, and you notice how much you learn from one another as you're... Okay, exactly.
Okay, so now what we will do is spend about, I don't know how much time we have, 5-10 minutes, and we're going to have you act as cultural anthropologists and do a little research about New Orleans on your devices, on your phones, or if anybody has a laptop or an iPad. Of course, in your classroom, you would let the students spend a long time doing the research. See what you can find out about New Orleans, Louisiana. Okay?
Okay.
Can you put New Orleans culture and see what it says?
Yeah, culture, yeah. We okay.
Acadian is in Canada,
It's in Canada.
It's in Canada.
In Quebec.
but also
Quebec.
Louisiana.
wonder
Yeah.
if
It came
Also
down.
Louisiana.
Came
Because
down.
I remember something about that
A
language.
dialect of French,
Yeah.
or
Okay.
Chia, typically settled in Quebec, but has gone to Cajun areas in Louisiana.
I
Yes.
don't know why I remember. That's one of those strange arcane
Yes, it
things
is.
that you remember. Like
Because I think
But
But
it
there's
is
more.
part of
There
the
are
Cajun
more.
French
Yeah,
language.
there are more.
When is Mardi Gras? When?
It says first a Tuesday before Lent.
That's correct. That's what Fat Tuesday is.
Before what?
Before Lent. That's the Fat Tuesday. Actually, before Ash Wednesday. That's the Mardi Gras.
The Mardi Gras Indians named themselves after Native Indians to pay them respect for their assistance in escaping the tyranny of slavery.
Oh, there we go.
It was often local Native Americans who accepted slaves into their society when they were making a break for freedom. So it's a recognition of their gratitude for that support.
See here right now is exactly the kind of climate you want to create in your classroom, where they don't want to stop. Okay? That's called developing a climate where, would you quit interrupting us? We're learning something. Because that is the role of the teacher, really, to shift that responsibility. The thing I tell my methods kids is, who's doing the work? Okay? If I'm doing all the work, I already got my PhD, I don't want to tell you, back in the Middle Ages, I don't need to be doing this work anymore. They need to be doing that work. And the work needs to be done by the learner, exactly. All right, so let's hear some quick reporting out. Some interesting facts. I learned something about India at this table. You want to share that?
I wondered, I one time happened upon the Indian parade at Mardi Gras time in New Orleans, and I wondered what the how the development came about, and so we just looked that up because the Indian chiefs are dressed in lots of feathers and costumes are portrayed by African Americans. So Pam just looked that up, and it turns out that the leaders of the groups do this in order to pay homage or tribute to the Native Americans who helped the slaves as they ran away and then housed them.
Now everybody went, oh. This is what I always say. You know, culture, you should be moving from ooh to oh to ah. That's my barometer of what we should be achieving. Exactly. And the other thing that happened there is they were able to investigate that which interested them. Okay? Now, in the article, you'll find a more structured approach using a Jigsaw cooperative learning activity that you can use with elementary, middle, and high school kids where they need a little more structure. We're all kind of motivated. But the idea behind this is to have you feel what it feels like to have the power to be able to pursue an inquiry approach to learning. Okay? Well, let's have one more and then we'll move on. Who would like to share what they learned? Okay.
We delved into all kinds of romanticized versions of New Orleans of what we know, what the media wants you to know. But then we also brought up the whole Katrina and how a whole new vision of New Orleans surfaced, that we certainly saw the haves and the have-nots and the status of different folks. So it was an interesting conversation to sort of blend what the media and what we know about sort of the romanticized in New Orleans and then the reality that came with a natural disaster.
Very true.
Another thing I like about this activity is you can, first of all, often students quickly jot down stereotypes. And it helps you break down those stereotypes once you investigate a little further. It's just a perfect example of that.
And if you do exactly what Sheri said, then you have the students go back now and take a look at what they wrote before on that large piece of paper. Like you can do this with Berlin, you can do this with Madrid, and then go back and cross out what no longer is true because they've investigated that knowledge themselves and realize it was done by them, and now they can accept it. It wasn't something said to them. And now they can cross that off and put the new knowledge and insight that they gained. Great activity to do with a huge piece of paper on the floor with kids. Now we're going to go to Deardorff. As you've already heard, my favorite model. And Deardorff, I like this because it really speaks to me as a teacher. So here's where you enter. You come in with kind of an attitude, right? What does respect mean? Starting with, you want to move from having a perspective and an attitude to one where you really want them to move away from judgment. Because I think of the example when I know this was insane, but I took middle school kids to Germany. And the first night, they were going to do us a special favor and have this raw meat to serve us, which is a specialty dish in Germany. It's the highest grade of hamburger with lots of, the kids said, "What's this, Dr. Moeller?" And I said, "What do you think it is?" And they said, "Well, it looks like raw meat." And I said, "Yeah, it does. What do you think? Should we taste it?" Well, I ain't eating any raw meat. Okay, well, you know, let's try it. There's always one kid that's willing. And he tries it and he says, hey, it's not bad. So we move from ooh to not bad. Okay, not everybody tried it, but the idea is to experience to move them from a negative to a maybe oh stance, okay? So this goes, then you give them added knowledge. Why do you think that they eat raw meat? Why? Because you're a special guest. This is something reserved for special, oh. Okay, so what does that mean for, should we taste it? Can we just send it back? Listening, observing, analyzing, and interpreting, and then moving to something that transforms me. A better example would be the example I gave of Spain and being kissed on both cheeks rather emphatically by this professor. Okay, my first thing was, whoa, what's going on here? And then as I realized everybody was greeting everybody else that way, I internalized that this is what we do. Okay, I wasn't quite comfortable with it, but I listened and I observed, and how did they use the formal or the informal? They were using the formal. Oh, so formally, knowledge is growing. They do this. And then my internal outcome was that I began to adapt to that way until the external, when I was able to hug somebody myself and kiss them on, well, not really kiss them, you kind of not do that. You just kind of pretend to. And so then that's kind of the cycle. Come in with an attitude, you gain knowledge, you begin to change internally, and then you go externally, you're able to do that.
And everyone comes in at a different level.
Exactly. They come in at a very different place. Some of us might already be here, where we have internalized some things, okay? So that's the thing about intercultural communicative competence. It's individual, very highly individual by all of us. Now, the next question then becomes, well, how do you assess this in the classroom? If this is an integral part of this is what I'm tackling right now. Well, just like language, there should be a portfolio of some sort. Where am I now? Where do I want to be? Scaffold, how do I get there? Okay, so the best way is to have kids do some critical reflection on their own in a journal, or little milestones, like that would have been a chapter for me. I can now kiss strange people, okay? And then go back and self-evaluate my development. Okay, why did this happen? Well, this is a sign of affection. This is me, how welcome. Okay, and so then here's the role of the teacher, to provide feedback, okay? So that cycle can develop.
And this ties in perfectly with Linguafolio.
Right.
And there's the passport, the cultural passport in the Linguafolio, and it provides a space where students can reflect.
Exactly, and then hit their milestones, record those aha moments that occur to them. Exactly.
Okay, so excuse me, what I'd like to do now is talk about a model that Deardorff developed for exploring attitudes with students, and it's called the OSCE Model, or you can remember it as, oh, I see. Okay, that helps you remember the steps. It's a 4-step process that works really well with authentic cultural videos. Or if you had actually native speakers that could demonstrate, that would be even better. But it works really well with videos. And what we like to do is first play the video with no sound. And the students are just asked to observe what is happening. Just watch, suspend their judgment. The whole idea is not to be judgmental, but just to observe, what do I see happening? And then the second step is for them to state, either in writing or orally, just objectively, what do they see? I see 2 people coming together. I see them kissing one another. I see them smiling. I see them talking. Whatever they see, just objectively, no judgment. Try and get them not to filter it through their lens. It's difficult to do, but it's something they can learn. Okay, then the third step is that they then, with a partner or in groups or as a whole class, explore those different explanations. Why do you think those things are happening? What could this mean? Okay, and so they share with one another, and then the fourth step, they evaluate all those different things they learned by doing some research. Maybe they do some research on the internet. Maybe you have something written for them to read about. Maybe they can interview a native speaker from that culture to find out Why is it that way? So this is this 4-step process, and again, then the students own the knowledge. It's not the teacher telling them this is why. So I thought we would practice.
Research does help you in practice, right? It's a great 4-step process that really gets kids to, and this is, Claire Crumch would love this because she talks about this as the 3rd space, right? By the way, Claire is retiring and we're having a big reception at Berkeley. Dort, are you going to be there?
I'm going to try to.
Good, all right. And she is the big culture guru, as probably all of us know. But this is a way to get at. So Sheri's going to play a video for you. And what we'd like you to do is just observe, right? Step 1. What's step 2? State what you see. What's step 3? Right? And step 4? Excellent. Good students. Okay.
Right.
Great.
Okay. I will try and play this first without the sound. This is a Chinese family, and so many of the Mandarin speakers will already understand what's happening, but of course your students wouldn't. So kind of put yourself in the role of the student and what would they see? Okay, now what we do is I would have students individually write down what they observed, but let's just do that as a group, just for purposes of time. What were some of the things you observed? Someone on this table, what did you see?
The boy ate the food first.
The boy ate the food first. How about this?
Picked the food up first.
Yeah, he picked his food. Okay.
I think we observed the same, that the boy just this was considered not good behavior. We just
How did you tell that?
communicated from the father just through the eyes.
Yeah.
And then
You got the
the
look.
boy was clever to read the face.
You got the look.
Yes, you got the look. Yes.
Okay, right. Okay, how about this table? Anything you've observed? How about?
The boy changed his behavior.
Okay. What did he do?
He started serving others.
Okay.
One at a time.
From the elders, I noticed.
From the elder side, from the
Rescue.
The,
The parents start serving the grandparents.
so the parents serve the grandparents.
Yeah, the boy.
Okay. Then the boy did. Okay. Anything else?
It's okay to pick up your dishes when you're eating.
Oh, good.
Interesting. It's
Anything
okay
else?
to pick up your dishes. I love that.
Yeah. Anything that you observed here? Anybody?
You notice that the youngest generation have to serve the most people in that. They have not only served the parents, but also the grandparents as well, and the parents. I mean, usually you want to serve someone who's more senior than you, but also you want to show affection to someone who's younger than you as well. But senior first and junior later.
Right. Okay. Great.
Okay, let's take a pedagogical moment here. Who's doing the work? And when they say what they've observed, it's theirs, not something the teacher has given them. You know, you don't want to do learning unto learners. You want to have it be done by them.
The teacher model.
Exactly.
And then this is the input.
But how did you feel when everybody else, you know, you're sharing something and everyone else is going, oh yeah, yeah.
I saw that.
This is the kind of atmosphere that you have to create in a classroom. And this is what we try to communicate in our institutes for STARTALK, is that you create an atmosphere so that they themselves experience this kind of joy. I call it flow because that's what Csikszentmihalyi calls it. When you are so engaged in learning, you forget all space and time. And that's kind of what happens in our institutes too, that we cannot get rid of these people at 5 o'clock at night.
True.
Because they are so into it. Now the question becomes, how do you do it? So pedagogical pauses is what we regularly kind of integrate into our workshops that we do with them.
Okay, lost.
And of course, what we would do then is we would play the video and they would listen to the language to add that language layer on. So what's really going on? Okay, so then you can confirm your hypotheses. Whenever you hypothesize something, you want to know what the answer is. See, those are little tricks you learn in psychology. There's the carrot. Now I want to know what the answer is, but you never give answers, just like when you're raising children. Why is the moon that big? Well, what do you think? Okay, let's see if what you think is right. It's easy to give the answer. Well, in my case, I had no idea. But some people probably do. But this is the same way a parent would get a child to be an inquirer, is the same way you want your students to do.
Okay, so I think you get the idea. We won't go through all the 4 steps, but that's an example of how you can use this OSCE model. All right?
Then you would write what's happening, right?
Right. We would write what's happening, and then we would discuss it, and then we would go do some research if we needed to. Here we could ask our Chinese speakers about, and I think we learned a little bit about the actual cultural practice.
And again, we're back to Byram. Byram is the person on whom really the Linguafolio bases its interculturality theory. And I think it's a good one because it's pretty concrete. You have to, what does it mean? It means you have skills, it means you have knowledge, and you have an attitude, all of which one is very, hard to get at. Skills are developmental, as are all of these, and knowledge is something that has to be included. There's an intricacy between those 3. Okay, Sheri, next slide. Okay, so an attitude here might be a goal that you could say, I can question my preconceived ideas and become more open to interacting with people from other cultures. Okay, you could measure that, right? You could provide some evidence for that, okay? I can explore and analyze facts about my own culture and the target culture, meaning I can access, I know where to go and how to get that kind of information. Exactly. And then the last one, I can discover through practice how to communicate and form relationships with individuals. Here's where the language piece comes in, so that I can actually communicate my ideas at various levels and use culturally appropriate behavior. Okay?
Okay, here comes our next activity.
Our next and last, right?
This is our last activity, right. So we're going to help practice this Byram's model, and here's the scenario. I'll read it so in case you can't see it. You have just arrived in America, and a new acquaintance has invited you to your first 4th of July party. When you arrive, your host greets you warmly and asks you to sit down while she gets you a drink. You notice an object on the table. All right? As you wait for your drink, you begin to question the purpose of the object in front of you based on its appearance and any prior knowledge you have of Americans and their celebrations. Okay, so this is how you can use artifacts to develop intercultural communicative competence. And so we're going to actually go through this activity, and I believe everybody has an artifact on their table. And what I would like you to do first in groups, and this is what I would have students do, is that I would have them answer these 4 questions before doing any research. Okay, the first one is, what is the object called? They may not know, but they can hypothesize. What do they think it's called in the target language? What is its purpose? How does this object relate to the 4th of July? And what is your impression of Americans based on this object? What do you think this tells us about the culture? Okay, so we're going to actually do this activity. And so go ahead with your groups and answer these 4 questions. You don't have to write it down, just discuss.
And it's good to let those who are not Americans take the lead.
Yeah, let the non-Americans take the lead, okay?
It's a headband with a hat on top of it. If it was a hat, that would be one thing. But a headband with a hat is... What is its purpose? To be, I don't, it's
but you also wonder what's in the hat.
Yeah, the hat.
What was this? You call the color. The color, the stars.
The colors are, yeah. But the purpose is just to
it's a carnival, it's a celebration.
Okay.
And
how does the object, we're answering
I don't know what
right? How does the object relate to the 4th of July? That's what we're talking about.
Stripes and stars.
Yeah, and the colors, red, white, and blue.
Colors,
How about the symbolism of the feather?
It's the whole idea to bring back sort of the patriotism and Uncle Sam being the symbol sort of he calls you to patriotic action, right? Uncle Sam sort of calls you to do it. If you have the background,
You're not
if you have the
separating your
exactly.
authority with your prior knowledge.
Exactly.
You could interpret it so many ways. Like this
Yes.
they have a lot of dolls.
Yes.
This is a doll hat. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Or it's a Chihuahua hat. And this could be.
Okay, so now the next step, what I would have my students do is they would get to do some research. And we'd probably do a Jigsaw cooperative learning activity actually, but we don't have time
We
to
describe
do it.
that in the article, so when it comes
Right.
out next time, you can take a look at
So
that.
in our case, what we'll do is you now want to do some internet research about your object and see what you can find out about it, and if you can answer these 4 questions after you've done your research. We'll see what you find out. Okay, so we'll spend 5 minutes or so and see what you can find out about your object.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Later said, the fierce beauty and proud independence of this great bird aptly symbolizes the strength and freedom of America. They chose it for independence, unwavering strength, long life, majestic beauty, and great courage.
Okay, so those are the characteristics. So long life. Do eagles live long?
They do. They live along.
Oh, they do?
They do, yeah.
Okay, so that's one of the reasons they chose this. And what was the other?
Majestic beauty, great courage, independence, unwavering strength.
Okay, so now we want to probably know more about the eagle as we're doing some research. Why does this animal represent unwavering courage?
Yeah, and this can be, I mean, because earlier I asked a question about whether it's native to America. So it can be a cross-disciplinary collaboration in the language classes and maybe biology classes, science classes, that they can do more explorations with other teachers.
Excellent. Okay. How about Uncle Sam's hat over here? We knew it was Uncle Sam's hat, but we weren't sure who Uncle Sam was. So that was
He's not going to be the one to talk about it.
All right.
What we found out is the Uncle Sam is Sam William, who was Wilson, who was the meat packer, and when during the 19th century, when he back then it's required that when you send the meat out, you need to stamp his name, and this also comes from the image for the recruitment later on. So that's why we have this hat here.
Yeah, and also we found out, it was kind of interesting, why the hat so tall, and then we checked it here. Well, we was guessing, maybe just trying to get people attentions, appealing, and also we checked the website. We find out this has, it's emphasized like the power, authority, and so they getting tall hats, just empower, with authority.
Excellent.
So we find out.
Okay, and do we have any other? Okay, all right, over there.
About the hat.
We gotta sing it. We gotta sing it.
Okay.
So here it goes.
We have here.
Yankee Doodle went to
It's coming. It's coming. Will you listen?
Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy. Mind the music and the step and the girls be handy.
Wow. The search for the song came after a question. This is, of course, the flag, the colors of the American flag, and this is for fun, some head dance.
You got to try not to show them.
But looks good.
That is owning the culture now.
And in a festive opportunity like celebrating 4th of July, you have these fun things to look at, but at the same time, what's behind that? What's the symbolic behind that? And my question was, of course, I lived in America for a long time, but I didn't know why the feather was here, what exactly. Then the research told us, first, this is Uncle Sam's hat, as you figured out, but the feather was highlighted as making fun of the British when somebody wearing Uncle Sam's hat after the revolution, after independence, and going to London just to ride a pony, and like trying to put down the British culture and put the superiority of Americans over that. So
yeah, we have to take it one step further because we did a little more research on it, and one of the things is not the lyrics, but the melody becomes a vehicle for battling back and forth. So the British had the song first, and they were insulting the Americans. And then the Americans take it, put their own lyrics on it, they insult the British, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. So something that you could do in the classroom, I guess.
Now, what is warming my heart here is the enthusiasm for learning that's going on. And you're feeling right now, this is precisely what will happen in your classroom. Why? Because they are doing the work and they're involved in the learning process actively, okay? And I think that is, and you don't want to stop because then you know, oh, well, what's this feather? Okay, and where does that come from? Will you remember this knowledge about the feather, do you think? You think long-term memory. Why? 90% of what you do is what you remember. 10% of what you read you remember. 20% of what you hear. 90% of what you do. So this gives you an example of kind of what we do in our institute. We actively involve our participants in these learning activities, and we do Mandarin. And so basically they get the feel of what it feels like, and then they create lessons themselves in which they model what they've learned. And then we actually also have a STARTALK Academy for high school students, and then they teach the high school students one that they've created themselves. It's a great little model. They learn, first they experience, they learn, and then they practice, and then they apply it themselves in working with real students. Okay. Our final activity, of course, is going to be, my middle name is reflection. Kids always say the R word, you know. Reflection. Reflection is the key to excellent teaching. Anytime you think about it's the key to interculturality. Reflecting upon what do I believe? What is this doing to what I believe? And the same thing is true of your teaching. You should always be asking, what can I do differently? Okay? Happy people, I love this quote. Happy people are those who look inside themselves and say, what can I do differently? Unhappy people look outside themselves and say, who's to blame? Okay? So always be thinking about yourself as someone learning, open, okay? So after you receive your M&Ms, find your color group, okay? And everybody grab an M&M. And then we're going to divide you into color group. Okay, and here's what you're going to do. Hold on. What type of preparation did the teacher have to do? Did the teacher have to be an expert in the target language? Did she? These are the things you're going to talk about. Who did the work? We kind of did that a little. Why was this type of culture lesson effective? How did this activity address Byram's attitudes model? What ideas do you have for building an activity? Those are the 4 questions you're going to answer in your color group. Yellow here,
choose a
brown
color.
Here. Little movement.
Does the teacher need to be an expert in the target culture?
I think the teacher needs to know what's interesting about the target culture in order to pick the right things,
You have to pick the right artifacts.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So I think you need to know enough to know what's interesting, right? And also what's maybe different between the target culture and your own culture. You know, the native, whatever it is, the culture that the
But
students
you
bring to
have to be
play.
an expert? No. You have to have an
You gotta have
idea.
expertise, though. I mean, you don't have to know everything, but I think you have to know enough to know, because it's really easy to not know enough.
It was very, very learner-centered, and it was to the point where they just were going very freeform into whatever they wanted to explore.
And isn't that one of our goals, is self-regulation, so they carry it outside the classroom, and you know that you're not, you know, I know teachers sometimes love that concept of power in front of the classroom, but what that happened, it puts so much of a burden on you. Instead, what you want to do is create an atmosphere where they are learning and they have some control. It's one of the major things in motivation theory. You have to have a sense of control over yourself. And that's the major issue with most teachers. They want to control. And the more you control, the less pleasant it is for all parties concerned.
Exactly.
That part of research has to be done in English, using their computers or iPad or iPhone. So then this is not kind of like a diversion from STARTALK mandate that use of target language was not 100% in the...
I think I would like to hear something about the use of target language.
Right. I think what you've done is you've used their native language only to help their thinking get further down that idea of how do I make a cultural comparison? How do I explore a perspective? Once I have that understanding, I have that idea that I've explored as we've been talking about, maybe in my native language. I mean, all of us, we go to our native language to do some deep level thinking. So that's what you're asking your learners to do. Now my job is to say, you have those thoughts, how do we bring that into something we can talk about? So if I give you the names of the objects and something as simple as in a Venn diagram where you would say, is this the word for hats? Are hats part of a patriotic celebration in the target country, in my own country, or in both?
Let's get some quick reactions. This conversation was exactly the one we have here.
And also the one behind you. It was
And
about
also,
target language.
the use of the target language. So who wants to tell us what you all came up with here at this table? Pam?
I think many people in the room shared the same wondering about how to facilitate this type of rich learning and discussion and discovery in the target language, especially at the novice level. So we were talking about how to scaffold that, and one of the ideas that emerged was the question of whether we could flip the learning experience so that students were having discussion about a cultural question through a social network discussion board, or doing their research outside of the classroom and then coming to class to share out their findings and the target.
And then I mentioned the project that Gilbert Fürstenberg did at MIT called Cultura, in which she actually had her beginning French students at MIT her topic at the time was Clinton, because he was having this rather nefarious affair with someone named Monica Lewinsky. And so the Americans were pretty irate about it, and they had heard that the French weren't so upset. So she said, well, this would be a great topic to kind of get, that's motivation right there, right? And so the Americans wrote about their impression of what had happened, essentially, in English, and sent it to the French, who then had to receive it in English, in a target language, right? And then respond in French. So then the MIT students received it in French and had to, were they motivated to unpack it? That's what she did in her classroom, okay? And so then they would unpack the ideas, and they really gained deep insights into a culture. So the French weren't so outraged about Clinton. Their perspective was, why do you care? This man is a politician. He's trying to run your country. Why do you care what he's doing in the bedroom? And of course, the American students are saying, what? He has no values. Family values, okay? So it's an interesting, so unpacking at that level, that's another way to do that. Did you come up with something at your table as well?
Well, we were just thinking of what you were suggesting of for novice learners, perhaps using not necessarily the same websites, or, in the target language, these websites would be unnavigable for most of these novice learners, but using really careful scaffolding, planning, maybe images or videos to help them access their own kind of reactions to some of these images, perhaps, might be a way to go forward. But I think we really weren't sure about the answer to this. We're trying to figure out exactly what time is appropriate for this type of activity for a novice learner, what tools to use. So yeah, we're still kind of questioning that.
We also talked at your table about purpose. You've always got to say, what's the purpose? And if the purpose is really to be transformative in their thinking, it's okay to do it in English. Right. ACTFL recommends 90%. It's up to you and your learners. Always remember that. Theory, I'm being a researcher, I know I love to say this is what research says, but honestly, if you really understand the word validity, all it means is interpretation. And so you're the expert that's interpreting what's going on in your classroom. So you're the valid judge, okay? So it's good to know the research, but it's also good to know who you're teaching, okay? So that's really the driving force. Anything you at this table wants to share?
Yeah, I mean, she was also sharing some of the similar things around scaffolding, but in our program, in our language summer camp, we have combination of both Arabic and Chinese classes happening, but then we also do leadership workshops, which is a separate space where we actually bring together Chinese language, Mandarin language learners and Arabic language learners. And that combines other aspects around leadership development, intercultural competency. So it's actually a separate space, as you were saying. Maybe that happens outside of actually the immersion classroom, where we're applying those principles. But then we have a separate space where we do actually the types of leadership work, which is more also about the relationship, about empathy, around communication, and that type of understanding. So
great, I'm getting some great ideas. Anyone else want to share anything?
Yeah, we talk about novice learners in target language in this kind of circumstances, but the added to that would be young novice learners will be even more difficult. For example, the third graders, where kind of trying to find ways that how we.
But they can still observe, can't they? Mm-hmm. They can observe, and then you have to decide, what is my purpose? Do I want them to deeply understand this concept? Then I'm going to let them work with English, images, text. If my purpose is to develop language, then we work around doing some work with the vocabulary and whatever it is your goal is. I think that's always, you always want to ask why you want to do that. But it is, you struggle, that's been the biggest issue. Teachers not knowing enough culture or feeling they don't know enough culture, and then how do you use the target language when you're dealing with abstract things. But I think we got some excellent ideas. Claudia?
Yeah, I just wanted to say we spent a time at the beginning of our discussion talking about what it meant for the teacher to be an expert. And we broke it down into two different categories. One is that we felt it was really important for the teacher to have all that information. Otherwise, the teacher is perpetuating stereotypes. But the teacher can't be the know-it-all. So when it comes to the activity itself, the teacher is not the expert, but the teacher has to have that expertise. And we just wanted to make sure that we distinguish both of those.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think.
And in addition, a wonderful or a thorough conceptual landscape of intercultural interactions. You need to have that background. Maybe not under specific culture, but you certainly need to have.
It's just like
the
in
models.
language.
You need to understand those models very well.
Exactly, and I think, and I think the same thing is true of teaching grammar. You have to understand where the misconceptions are, that you anticipate them as you're teaching. That's why research is important. That tells us, we know that pronouns are the most challenging thing. Noun-pronoun substitution is a huge point. When they can do that, you can almost measure what their level of proficiency is. So we know that. So we really have to work on pronouns, not teach them the first week. So you have been an amazing audience. We wish you a great conference.